well, thank you very much. But if you allow me, I just want to comment on the question of the churches, because Reverend Robert, I thank him very much. He presented the role of the Western Church, and we do have Western churches. But I would like to remind you of a fact. Surely you know that the church in Palestine is 2,000 years old. That's where the church started. And that's where the church continues today. We have national Palestinian Arab churches who have contributed to the development of Christianity in the land, but also in the last century developed to the renaissance of the Arab nationalism, and in terms of journalism, in terms of writing, in terms of leading politically in the political movements. And today, when the beginning of the Palestinian liberation movement, there were priests who participated in the executive committee and on the National Council, and we have heroes who also participated in the struggle throughout the years. And this church suffers the occupation just as we normal people suffer, and these priests suffer alongside. I also want to say that Christianity in the Holy Land, or Islam or Judaism, Palestine has always been a land of diversity. People, sometimes families, change their religion with the occupier, and Palestine has always been a land of occupation, actually. Now, one little detail is, because we are a land of occupation, we continue to be today. The big mistake that is usually done, and it's a deadly mistake, confusing the state of Israel today with Israel of biblical times. Actually, we are the people of the land, and we are the occupied people, as were the Jews 2,000 years ago. And Israel is part of empire that Robert has so well explained. Having said that, on apartheid, the establishment of the state of Israel is based on pure racism. It was established through the strategy of getting rid of Palestinians, as many Palestinian Christians and Muslims as possible. It started in the last century, and the British mandate has helped already to start getting rid of Palestinians early on in the century. In 1948, 3/4 of the population was literally evicted out of Palestine and were simply never allowed back. The border was closed. People left their homes with the food on the table and the clothes hanging in the cupboard to come back in 2 or 3 days. They were never allowed back. Many Palestinians who live inside Israel today, in 1948, when they left their homes, they came back. They were in the country in another village. They came back to see that their house was occupied by Israeli settlers and were not allowed to get their house back. So we have about 300,000 people dispossessed and who are Israeli citizens. So the structural racism was in place since the beginning, since 1948. This structural racism was not legalized through a constitution, and up to today Israel doesn't have a constitution, so they continue freely to practice that kind of racism and not allowing the world to criticize. Since 1948, Palestinians who continue to live inside Israel lived the same reality that we live, the apartheid we live now in the West Bank and also in Gaza in a different way. They have squeezed them out of their land in every village and every town through building of roads, mainly. And when you build a road, 4 or 5 roads around the village, you take away all the land. And I've seen villages in the Galilee where people just build, they're like sardines, you know. It's like a cake. One village doesn't even have roads. And its land has all been taken, even though it's available. And it has been taken to be used by Israeli immigrants who brought into the country, who have the only people who have the right of return, so to speak, after 2,000 years. Even though I would also like to make another correction, the Hebrew people of 2,000 years are not the Jews of today. And probably most of the Palestinians today, or many of them originally, were the Jewish people of 2,000 years. So the structural racism whereby you have, even inside Israel for Israeli citizens, I'm not talking about people occupied in 1967, there are 2 educational systems. The job opportunities are very rare for the Palestinians. Educational opportunities are rare. Funding for the local government is minimal. The roads, the service roads, are not as developed as Israeli roads that service kibbutz or cities. They're treated like the enemy inside Israel. They were the dangerous people. They're not full citizens. Now, in 1967, when Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, the same system has been pursued, basically getting rid of as many Christians and Muslims as possible, and taking as much empty land as possible. This has become very, very visible with the construction of the apartheid wall, which supposedly was a security wall that was to divide Palestinians from Israelis, but as a matter of fact, it was built on a border of 350 kilometers, but it's 770 kilometers long. It is built only 15, I think, or 20% on the Green Line, which is the border. It's built in a very sinuous way to take as much land as possible and get rid of Palestinians. You see it. It's very, very sinuous. And it is real apartheid because it allowed people to stay where they are, squeezed in their residential areas, even in the village, while their people are not allowed access to their resources, either to the water or even to mobility. When some peasants have been stuck inside the wall on the Israeli side, they were allowed only them to go in and work their land, for example, or a business. So slowly but surely, all these lands stuck behind the wall that Israel built is not being cultivated because it's just not possible to do it alone. You know, people need farmers and workers to help. The water in the West Bank, once Israel occupied, immediately they took control of all the water resources. We buy it at a higher rate than an Israeli buys, even though the standard of living is 1/30th of the standard of living inside Israel. We're much poorer, but we pay more for water. Plus, they take the liberty to use water for the settlements, the use of settlements, swimming pools, green lawns. They water the desert as they like because they think the desert is Switzerland, perhaps, while we can't access sometimes not even the minimum of the World Health Organization. Ever since the occupation, if you pursue this economic statistics and you see how Palestinians who are naturally entrepreneurial, they manage to make a living, they manage to do business, they certainly work the land, how that economy has been diminished over the years. Since 1988, maybe we need 10 or 20 years to recover under normal circumstances the standard of our living in 1988. We were better off before the first Intifada. They thought we were very ungrateful when the uprising happened in ungrateful for that occupation. So we were very heavily penalized, and the apartheid system became very, very apparent in terms of increasing settlement construction, expropriating more land, more water, the construction of the wall, and a whole network of first-class roads, highways that serve the settlements, while our road system has been completely destroyed to the extent we don't find the road anymore. I mean, if I were to drive north, I won't find the road because they have been destroyed, and we were pushed back to use mandatory roads and Ottoman roads. Maybe Jerusalem maybe let me mention Gaza first, because they have withdrawn from Gaza in 2005 only to create a huge prison where they control every access, the air, the water, and the land, and they have put Gazans under prison to the extent that Wilkinson, who was head of the World Bank, when he was appointed as head of the quartet envoy in Palestine, he resigned in 6 months. He said, what you are handing over is this big prison. There is no possibility of life or certainly any kind of development. Gaza today is a basket case with everything destroyed. Infrastructure, the private sector, even Gazans are very entrepreneurial. 95% at least of the private sector has been destroyed. Educational system, agriculture, you just name it. In the West Bank, before I go to Jerusalem, the agricultural sector has shrunk from 2000 by 25%. industry by 15%. So we're really going backwards in terms of structural economy. And then we live on aid, of course. Everybody's giving money. This money is not developing the country in a sustainable fashion. They just keep us going. And a study by a Palestinian organization for 2010, they calculated the cost, the damage of the occupation. It was little less than $7 billion a year for an economy that is a GNP of $4 billion. We don't need any aid, just get rid of that occupation and that apartheid system. And we don't want any money at all, no handouts. And Gaza, 80% of the people live on food handouts. We have to live on food handouts. Jerusalem is a microcosm of the occupation, and maybe where all the manifestations are highly concentrated. It's not that they denied us access to our holy sites. People in the West Bank cannot access Jerusalem, Christians or Muslims. But in addition to that, I'll speak as a Christian. I know they also give the our Muslim brothers the same hard time. They want to cut off the communication, the contact with our holy sites. But not only that, with the practice of traditions that are hundreds of years old. And as a Christian, I speak, from 2005, they have been denying us access to the holy city inside the old city of Jerusalem to practice the traditions that are 2,000 years old during Easter week, for example. Like every 30 meters, you have a checkpoint. We spend Easter week, instead of praying, fighting with the soldiers and getting tear gas, etc. Jerusalem is being killed as a city. First is demography. We are defined as a demographic threat, according to the Israelis. In Jerusalem, they managed through ethnic cleansing policies. You know, if you go abroad, you can't come back. They take away your ID. There is no housing. I mean, my children, I know, to find a house in Jerusalem, impossible. To find a job in Jerusalem, impossible. They managed to kill any kind of the possibility of a normal life, especially for the educated. Certainly no housing. And the educational system suffers a lot. 15% of the students leak out of school before they finish. The jobs available are only for the workers. You know, 98%, once I did a study, of jobs are only for low strata employees, you know, cleaners, things like that. If you really succeed, you become a bank clerk. Withdrawal of identity cards is regular business, and we are terrified. We live a regular nightmare since '67. Can we keep our paper? Do we have to show ourselves? We can't stay abroad for too long. I was ambassador in France, and after 4 years, they're telling me, you don't live here. You don't live. When my husband was there, and I have a house, and I have children there. You go and visit the neighborhood in East Jerusalem. You think you're visiting a neighborhood from the Middle Ages. The roads, some of them have not been paved since '67. You know, the dirt, and people are not allowed to build, so they build a shack here and a room there. Finally, they managed to reduce the population of Jerusalem from 350,000. Now, I think, we don't have statistics, but probably they reduced them to 120,000 who live inside the city. And the wall has even excluded some Jerusalem neighborhoods outside the wall, so slowly and surely these people also, I think, eventually will lose their rights. I don't want to take all the time because there are lots of stories to tell, but Palestine is a land of diversity. We are Palestinians, Christian, Arabs. We're proud of our identity. It applies to everybody. What Israel is doing, the apartheid, is not about land and water and schooling, etc. It's a cultural dispossession. Now, for a long time actually, but now much more apparent, they want to take away our narrative, our story. They want to deny us our identity throughout history, and asking us to acknowledge Israel as a Jewish state, and hence giving our whole story and narrative and culture and heritage on a silver plate. And eventually maybe we have to apologize for them for being in the country. The Palestinians have changed the strategy from struggle to negotiations. Unfortunately, Israel bad will has now showed itself very visibly and very explicitly by saying they are not interested in the two-state solution now. And through that process, the Palestinians paid a very, very high price of giving up on the institutions of the PLO, which was the institution that organized the struggle. Now we are in a period of where we don't have a clear vision now, because the political process has failed, and we don't have a clear substitute, and we are in a period of transition. I personally wouldn't worry about Palestinians. They proved to be so resilient. What we have been through for a whole century, in spite of the immigration and the violation of rights and the expropriation of resources, somehow this people hangs on, and they keep their spirit and they keep their faith. The churches, we have national churches, and they stood with authority, as churches normally do. They stand with authority. But authority in the leadership of the churches, remember, are in Jerusalem, and it's occupied East Jerusalem. I know for a fact that the Israelis give them a very hard time. They were, for example, exempted from paying the water bills. So they didn't. All of a sudden they come and they say, you didn't pay water bills from 1967. And they ask them for huge amounts of money. That the churches are not very good business people or good managers. And probably they're quite messy sometimes. There is not the Lutheran Church, of course, Reverend Mitri, you're very organized. No, but really they are, the churches are having a hard time to deal with the harassment from Israel itself. They don't speak about it. They are also under a lot of political pressure, and Israel tried to make them seem like they are not Arab churches. And what Israel, as a matter of fact, did, they brought in, with the Russian immigrants that they brought them in the 90s, they brought about 600 and more thousand Russian Christians. I mean, it's not like suddenly Israel is fond of Christians. I'm sure they're not. But they wanted to dilute the Christian Arab-Palestinian character of the country. They have nationalized about 120 foreign workers, Christian foreign workers, also inside Israel itself, again to dilute, and they're trying to pass a law in the Knesset saying that Christians are not Arabs. I'm just trying to tell you about the manipulation that is in place. But the relationship between leadership and church is very good, between the leadership and the Christians, who are really now, so many have immigrated because of the difficult economic difficulties. But we have at least 2 ministers in the cabinet that are Christians. We have, like, certainly above our ratio in terms of members of legislative council, including many towns and villages have quotas whereby the mayor is a Christian and other members. So that relationship is fine. I want to move to the perception of Palestine as a Muslim issue. It was intended, and because Israel was hoping to transform, and maybe they succeeded to a certain transform the conflict from a political land-grabbing issue to a religious conflict, because religion have been used throughout history. We know in the Middle East more than anywhere else. That's how rulers controlled the populations. And that's how Israel, when they get people agitated and angry and very, very emotional, as what they try to do around Al-Haram al-Sharif on regular basis, on daily basis, it's arousing emotions that are religious emotions, taking people's attention away from the political conflict and the whole world, and presenting to the whole world the conflict as religious, saying, the Christians, you have the Vatican, these Muslims, you have Mecca, go to Mecca, but Jerusalem is ours. That's their logic, and we need to fight that logic, of course, and unfortunately they have the media. You know, we just have, because you said that there was color racism. You know, we have the same colors there. There is no difference really in color. And there are blondes, blue-eyed among Palestinians because they're stayed over from the Crusader time. And there are very dark-skinned among the Israeli Jews who came from Yemen or elsewhere. But it's structural discrimination. It's how you move, liberty of movement. It's your socioeconomic rights. It's controlling your life altogether, that you have no room for development. So it's different, and I just remind you that Tutu said it's even worse than apartheid. And on youth participation in the political events, youth make political, I mean, most of the youth, every day there are skirmishes and confrontations with the army. The intifadas, the youth have been very, very active, and they are very often part of political factions and political parties. And they make up 65% of the Palestinian democracy, so we are a very young community. There are many organizations, Jewish organizations, inside Israel as well and in other parts of the world, who support the struggle of Palestinians because it's a struggle for justice. It's a struggle for international law. And BDS certainly is one way to do it. But also the voices of Jews, because the Christian West has this horrible guilt feeling because of the Holocaust during the Second World War and the history of anti-Semitism, for which they're making Palestinian price. It's sometimes very important that the Jewish voice speaks to these Westerners and Europeans that this cannot be done. Don't do that in our name. So that's something you can do. On the question of one state and living together, I would like to remind you that the PLO Charter in the 60s called for a one state. And Palestinians know, I mean, the Jew and the Christian and the Muslim live next door to one another and help one another. That's what Palestine has been about until the first immigrations in the 19th century of the Jewish and further immigration in the 20th century. However, Israel, of course, refused that. Remember, the project is a colonial project, which has a lot of interest behind it. But anyhow, the fact is today that there is Israel, a state, and a Jewish culture, and a language, and there are the Palestinians. Because of that, accepted what happened throughout recent history. We accepted Israel as a state, and we wanted to live next door to Israel in a Palestinian state, and it doesn't mean we gave up our rights in our homeland, which is historical Palestine, but we accept a political solution. But that's not good enough for Israel. Now, most people, especially the younger people, there are lots of debates and discussions. Since Israel has refused the two-state solution, we live, any case, like Amira Haas says, we live in one state. It's one border, one power, police, military, two systems of laws, two systems of road, two systems of education, etc. And the only way forward is to have one state, but maybe binational state, since there are these two cultures and two states. And most young people would tell you they don't even want to discuss the two-state solution. It's passé for them.